You know, a good reminder from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 is God always pierces the darkness, always. And the darkness doesn't last.
And the high priest, the great high priest who is Jesus Christ, he puts his hands on your life and you take your hands off and you say, my life is surrendered for your purposes.
I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Downline podcast. I'm Jamie Trussell, privileged to be your podcast host as well as serving as the lead pastor of Redeemer Dripping Springs in the Texas Hill Country. We certainly hope this podcast helps you faithfully walk with Jesus while pouring your lives into others. And today we are joined by Dr. John Pennington, who one of his books I read a few years ago in my doctoral studies, and it really impacted me. And so, Dr. Pennington, thanks so much for being willing to come on.
Hey, thank you. It's a joy to talk with you.
For those that may not be familiar with you, take a few minutes and just give our audience a bit of a flyover of who you are, your background, and what you're currently up to.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, where I very happily live in two worlds. I'm a full-time professor of New Testament and really just teach the Gospels almost exclusively just because our department's big enough. But I'm also a pastor, one of the teaching pastors at Sojourn East Church. And that includes preaching a lot I run our men's ministry. I do a lot of counseling, which I love, a lot of mentoring and discipling of people. And I'm really thankful for that combination of both the academic training and world that I live in and the church. And it's a wonderful season of life where both engines are firing fully, or I'm firing on all cylinders. And my wife, Tracy, and I have been married 32 years. We have 6 adult children, 1 grandson, and another one on the way. And 5 of our 6 kids live within 5 or 10 minutes of us. So we're together all the time. My daughter's on staff at our church.
That's fun.
And various other people. So we have a very rich life. My wife's a professional mosaic artist. She does big mural mosaics, etc. I travel a lot to a lot of churches all over the place, theological institutes, and I love all of that as well. And I play a lot of golf, so there's that.
Hey,
as well.
what's your now? So do you get to play Valhalla?
I did play it like a month ago. I've played it several times. I'm not a member there though. But
hoping you're the inside track.
Well, I do have quite a few friends that are members, and I'm a member of a not quite a fancy club, but a nice club as well. So.
Oh, that's fun. Okay, so I was mentioning you before we started recording, studying out at Talbot, and my professor, Dr. Greg Gansel, gave us your book, Human Flourishing and the Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. Yep.
Yes. Look, I went to Auburn. We get a lot of things backwards. But in that, it intrigued me because it was such a a robust theological reading, not as much just a diving right in technical biblical commentary, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It does have that for sure. Yep. But the Greco-Roman world, even the philosophical background of what's happening and what's being answered and pursued was just so helpful. And I was hopeful that you could start by giving us like 30,000 foot view of kind of the angle you're approaching the Sermon on the Mount on, the backdrop through which, against which Jesus is teaching, and how that helps us understand the text.
Yeah, very happy to. The Sermon on the Mount has become just a huge part of my both professional life and, more importantly, my personal life over the last 15 years. I did my PhD in Matthew, and so I would study Matthew a lot and teach the Gospels in Matthew a lot. But about 15 years ago, I've often told this story on podcasts and other things, it's just a total accident, like most of my life, that I got into the Sermon on the Mount. And that is that I just saw in the course catalog that there was a elective that nobody had taught in forever called the Sermon on the Mount. I thought, well, I could do that. I know about Matthew. And I very quickly realized I was way in over my head. And it really began a journey of giving a lot of my time and energy, personally, pastorally, academically, to trying to understand what turns out to be the single most influential part of the whole Bible. So in the last 2,000 years, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 to 7, there have been more sermons, books, quotes of it, anything than any other part of the Bible. I mean, you even see it in broader culture, right? I mean, just the Golden Rule and
Sure.
all, the Lord's Prayer. People that aren't even Christians understand. Gandhi and others talked about the Sermon on the Mount. I had a student from Peru who was just telling me that the former president of Peru, like, I don't even know if he's a Christian or not, but he like saw the Sermon on the Mount as the key to like how to be a good public speaker. It's just
Wow.
like the Sermon on the Mount is like, and wrote books about it and everything in Spanish. So it's a whole world. And I didn't realize that when I got into it. I quickly, like I said, realized, oh my, I've got a lot to learn. So I really just set out to try to kind of educate myself. And the biggest thing you first learn is that because it's been so influential, Christians have read it in a lot of different ways.
Lots of
Like
different
it
ways.
may, yeah, it may not be as, you and I might just read it and just think, oh, well, it's saying this. But once you start looking at what we call the history of interpretation, or how different Christians have read it, you see, some obviously not great readings of it, but you also see a lot of really good insights that are very different than maybe what we might tend to think, right? And so I began to study all of that. And what resulted for me, probably the biggest uh, change for me that you already mentioned, was kind of recognize that, yes, obviously the Old Testament is crucial to all of the New Testament, including the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is addressing, how do you think about the Old Testament law? That's one of the big issues
Yeah.
in the Sermon on the Mount. But that's not the only thing going on in the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, like all of early Christianity, is also in dialogue with the Greek and Roman world. Because after all, the New Testament's written in Greek, not in
Right.
Hebrew, not in the language of the Old Testament, but in the common language of the day, and is intending to connect to and explain the truth of Jesus, not just to Jewish people, yes, to Jewish people as well, but to the broader world. Because the crucial part of Christianity's understanding is, as the Apostle Paul says, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. Obviously, there are those different categories of people, but when it comes to salvation and the
That's
message
right.
of the good news of Jesus, it's for all people, right?
Right.
And so the New Testament's written in Greek, and the Sermon on the Mount is, I think, very clearly dialoguing
Mm.
with the common philosophies of the day, the common Greek and Roman philosophies. And once you start understanding those, which is what I then gave myself an education in, it started to open up a lot of what Jesus is saying there, is that he's actually interacting with, critiquing, but still in dialogue, a genuine dialogue with the common philosophies of the day, especially Stoicism, Aristotelianism, others. So that was a big part of how I came to read it and see certain things in that light.
Well, and I'd love to dig into that a little bit more, just baseline understandings of whether Stoicism or Aristotle's influence in those things. But what are, just to back up to something you mentioned earlier, what are some misreadings that you think are they're innocent, they are right, well intended, but as you survey kind of that history of interpretation, are there some that you think are more prevalent now that you'd love to comment on, of like maybe there's a better angle than these common misreadings?
Yeah, sure. I think there are. And my experience is that most of the readings have some insights, and that's the good, humble, charitable reading. But I do think there are some deficiencies in a long tradition of how the monastic reading would be, or how monks would tend to read it in most of Western Christianity. There was a real distinction between parts of the Bible that applied to everybody and parts of the Bible that only applied to the clergy or the priests.
Okay.
And the Sermon on the Mount, in that mindset, the Sermon on the Mount would only apply to clergy because it has such high demands and call to turn the other cheek and to never lust and never to, be angry even, and to give up your wealth, etc. A lot of Christians for a long time said, well, this is not something I can even do, right? So this is only for clergy. And I think that's problematic. I think Jesus meant
Sure.
it to be a call to discipleship for all people, including you and me down here today. Another misreading that's probably very common in the Protestant tradition, especially maybe Luther's reading, and this is complicated, but I'll try to keep it simple, is basically that the Sermon on the Mount is not something you can do, not because it's only for priests, but because its demands are so high
Hmm.
that really the point of the Sermon on the Mount, many Christians would say, is just to show you that you can't do it.
Sure.
It's really just to be a kind of a message of law or condemnation so that you will flee to Christ's forgiveness. And I always want to, I always say to students and church members, like, that's not untrue. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the point of the sermon. The point of the sermon is not just to show you that you stink, right? It actually is a call to discipleship, not to earn your salvation, but it's not just showing you that you can't do it. It is giving some direction. So I think that's a pretty common misunderstanding. The one more I'll mention is kind of the opposite extreme of that you'll see in some Christian traditions. And that is that the Sermon on the Mount is something that you can do perfectly, right? And so like Matthew 5:48 in English is really, I think, a really unfortunately misunderstood verse, a mistranslated verse, where Matthew 5:48 in English often says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect."
Yes.
Well, some people have read that to say, well, I can't do that, so I just need forgiveness. That's true. Some people in some traditions have said, well, I need to strive to reach this state where I no longer sin, this kind of sinless perfectionism. You don't run across that as much today as you used to, but in some traditions that's still there. And that's really just based on, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of that verse, and also a misunderstanding of kind of Jesus' call to discipleship, which is not that we'll ever be sinless or not sin, but really what Matthew 5:48 is talking about is wholeness. So not perfection in the sense of like free from sin, but like consistency between your heart and your behavior. It's always going to be perfect in this before the new creation, but so that one often grieves me a lot, to think of how burdened people probably feel by Matthew 5:48. Like, you have to be perfect. No, this is an invitation from Jesus to become more whole, to let your insides and your outsides match a little bit more.
Well, I'll mention one, and I won't say where I heard it, just because it's where I did my master's work, and it was such a blessing in so many ways. But this was something I'd never heard that I really wrestled with. Ultimately landed in a different spot, but I did have a professor in seminary tell me one time I didn't need to concern myself with the Sermon on the Mount, because that's for the kingdom, and that's in the future.
The Millennium Jews or something like that in a dispensational view.
And I had not heard that angle on the Sermon on the Mount, almost as like, set it to the side. Basically, we're not concerned with that yet, type stuff. Is that something you've come across?
That's a very problematic reading, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
In fact, one clever scholar in his surveying the history of interpretation titles it "A History of Evasions of the Sermon on the Mount." In other words, it's like, here's all the ways that Christians have tried not to do it, that's unfortunately one of them, probably.
Okay, so I read 3 years ago, and I read was reading your work. I underlined tons of stuff. I opened it back up, just kind of looking through, and here's what I underlined. And I love this because it gives so much clarity to what you're pursuing. You say, I'm providing a reading of the sermon that situates it in the dual context of Jewish wisdom literature and the Greco-Roman virtue tradition, both, and this is where they kind of tie together, both of which are concerned with the great theological and existential question of human flourishing. So what do you mean by human flourishing? Because I can hear plenty of Christians right now, hey, we're meant to be about kingdom, and our true life is with Jesus, and it's in heaven, and it's in the new heavens and new earth. And what is even meant by this concern of human flourishing?
It's nice to hear a quote and go like, oh, I like that sentence. I'm glad I agree with that.
Who wrote that? That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I believe in that. Brilliant. And this could be a really fruitful hour-long conversation, so I'll try to keep it really short.
Sure.
But this and another book of mine that is even, I think, even more accessible that students or listeners might enjoy is called Jesus the Great Philosopher, Rediscovering the Wisdom Needed for the Good Life. And that's where I do take that idea of human flourishing and kind of show it throughout the whole Bible, and in a even more accessible way, like not written as an academic book, at a kind of a thoughtful space, it's called. So recommend that to people as well. But what I argue in that book is maybe the easiest way to get at this, and that is that all humans, every religion, every philosophy, every advertising campaign, every CrossFit gym, everybody is trying to answer the question, how do you really be happy? And I mean, like, not just in a simple, short, temporary emotional way, but shalom, like the biblical, use the biblical idea. How do you actually, or Psalm 1, flourishing is actually the best translation there. Happy in the deep sense, not just blessed,
Mm-hmm.
but the sense of how do you experience the blessings of God in the sense of like true shalom. I think I probably like the word shalom the best. The sense of satisfaction, a meaningful life in connection to God and connection to others. So it's not devoid of God at all. In fact, that's the biblical understanding, is the only way ultimately to find true human flourishing is in connection with God. But that doesn't mean it's like disconnected from the earth. It doesn't mean it's disconnected from other humans. It doesn't mean it's disconnected from the pleasures that God has made in the world, right? Food and sport and, relationships and everything. And so to just start with the basic understanding that that's really what drives all humans. And that's not a wrong question.
Okay.
In fact, the Bible cares about that question and is offering its own answer to it. I mean, that was the eye-opening moment for me many, many years ago, is to recognize the Bible's not afraid of that question of how do you experience true human flourishing or true shalom. In fact, it's talking about it the whole time. It's just that its answer is very different than what the world offers. The question is exactly the same, and the Bible's not scared of it, but the answer is pretty radically different, that it's only in relationship to God, and then in the New Testament, only in relationship to God through Jesus Christ. And especially what's unexpected is that it actually entails suffering. And that this is probably the most distinct aspect of the Christian or the Judeo-Christian understanding of flourishing as compared to like Stoicism or many other psychological forms today. And that is that it actually embraces the reality of loss and grief and suffering as paradoxically not the opposite of human flourishing, but actually part of it as we long for the redemption. And you see this in the Sermon on the Mount very clearly with the Beatitudes. All those initial statements, which are statements about how to find true life or flourishing, all of those statements are, almost all of them are negative, like poverty of spirit, hungering and thirsting. Being merciful means you give up some of your rights and choose love and forgiveness over you getting justice always. Being a peacemaker is the same way. That's not talking about the United Nations or something. It's talking about like that you choose to make peace rather than insist on I was right here. All the Beatitudes. The only one that is potentially not clearly negative is purity of heart, because that's this idea of the whole Sermon on the Mount of wholeness. But being persecuted, he even says, is flourishing, right? So this is this fundamental idea again that the Bible is willing to entertain and is entertaining the exact same question that every human has always asked themselves, but its answer is, in my opinion, the most profound, the most nuanced, the most sophisticated, the most realistic view that you can actually find true life now and then ultimately in the future through a relationship with God in Christ. And that we don't have to deny the reality of grief and pain and suffering. Those, God uses those as part of the truly human flourishing life that is both joy and pain together. So that's the shortest version of it I can give. There's a lot more to say, but hope that helps.
Well, no, that's super helpful. And it's a great word. How then? So we're sitting here, thankfully redeemed by Jesus, moving about in a world where probably a lot of our friends and family aren't. To what concern, or is there a concern for the Christian as it relates to human flourishing? Is that meaning, well, now this is an evangelistic call because you can't truly flourish if you're not rightly related to God in Christ? Or are there also other things we can do out in the world that promotes general flourishing for all, or is that impossible when disconnected from Jesus?
No, I think it is. I mean, and I would root that in a couple of things: the important Christian theological tradition of common grace, that God is, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, God loves all creatures, all his creatures made in his image, and causes rain and sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. He has a special relationship with his redeemed creatures who respond in faith and faithfulness to him, who are born again into his family. But he loves all creatures made in his image, and he loves the whole world, but all humans are made in his image, even the most sinful ones, right? And so this, I'd rooted in that, this idea that we are doing, in fact, Jesus says, live your life and do good in the
Mhm.
world, so that even those who don't believe, and Peter picks up on this, says the same thing, can glorify God in seeing your good works. And I would also root it in this fundamental idea from Genesis 1 and 2, that to be a human being made in God's image is to be a priest in the world. And that's language that is going to reappear in Exodus and then in First Peter chapter 2 as well.
Yep.
And that is specifically a kingdom of priests. And I'm getting that from the charge, what we call the cultural mandate that God gives to Adam and Eve, that they are to tend and to cultivate and care and really bless the world by organizing it and caring for it. And that cultural mandate doesn't go away with the
Yeah.
fall. In fact, in
Right.
many ways, it kind of ramps it up in the sense that it makes it harder to do, but it's still the call of what it means to be human, is to be his gardeners in the
Mhm.
world.
That's a good word.
And actually, I'm writing a talk right now for a conference I'm speaking at in October on faith and work at a conference called Co-Labor. And the talk I'm giving is on the question of what's the relationship of the cultural mandate to the greatest commandment, to love God and love others, to the Great Commission. And so I'm calling them the great mandate, or the great cultivation, the great commandment, and the Great Commission. And I'm
Right.
afraid that in our evangelical tradition, especially, we've unconsciously usually kind of thought that the Great Commission maybe cancels out those other
Mm.
commandments, or at least kind of makes us neglect them. But I would like to argue and suggest that all three of those are of a piece. That the Great Commission, the making disciples of all nations, is the same priestly work of loving God and loving neighbor, which is the same priestly work of the cultural mandate of doing good in the world and blessing the world. That the way the world is blessed is through inviting people into a discipleship relationship. But that doesn't mean that the rest of our work in the world doesn't matter, because it's still part of building beautiful things and
Sure.
organizing the world and cultivating it, et cetera. So I would want to just say, let's look at those three big moments and recognize these are not in competition with each other. They're all part of the same.
Well, where do you, and thanks for sharing that, where do you land as far as, like, I'd honestly, just, I'm 42, I've been paid to be a Christian for a long time, right? And, been to a couple different schools, but the concept of human flourishing had really never entered into a single discussion I ever had
Yeah.
until I was, with Dr. Gansel doing philosophy at Talbot. Why do you think that is? I mean, because you make a good argument in your book that the whole blessed, you know,
Yeah.
where
It's
a lot
baked
of
into the
times,
words of the Bible. Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Right.
you get down to linguistics as far as why that's the best understanding of it. So,
What happened?
what
Yeah.
happened? Yeah, that's
Right.
my,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. I'm
Yeah.
gonna let you ask yourself questions from now on,
I
because
know.
that's what I
Let's
was
go.
getting at.
I'm
Yeah,
so
what
glad
happened?
you asked it. And this was part of the whole journey for me, is like, once I started to see this, I'm like, am I crazy? Because this is not what I was taught as well. But it does come down to even baked into particular words. Not that word studies are the only thing, but in this case, they really matter. That the word makarios, which we translate as blessed, that doesn't mean blessed in the sense of like God doing it. It's an invitation to human flourishing. And you read the book if you want to see the whole chapter dedicated to that word, right? But I think what happened was that actually this is the way Christians talked through most of the church's history. Once, there's a super brief version of it, in the medieval West, so the Middle Ages in the West, there tends to be a shift towards a more legal, kind of judicial way of talking about the Bible and its instructions. Then the Reformation, so the Protestant Reformation, is kind of in that vein, and really emphasizes on in a legal category that we can be forgiven, justified by faith. We can have a legal standing with God that has nothing to do with us earning favor. And that's so true and so important. But notice already that's a shift away from this bigger idea of God at work to bring shalom to our lives, or it kind of reduces it down to kind of the legal courtroom metaphor or image, rather than the kind of life itself and a fullness of life that you kind of see more in the Gospels, right? And then I think once you get into the modern period where then religion gets separated from all the other parts of life and the Enlightenment, like medicine and all the other things work together, they're all woven together. Then religion just becomes about this kind of like spiritual experience and not about the body and not about relationships. You know, I mean, none of us would want to say it that way, but in effect, that's kind of what happens. We've kind of come to think of the Bible as applying to the spiritual part of our lives, and then we go to other places for the other parts of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's like a super short version of it, but there were certain historical and theological moves that were made that started to tilt us away from this, and then we find ourselves pretty far away, especially maybe as Protestants. I think other branches of Christianity didn't stray as far as we did, honestly. And part of the help I found was in reading older commentaries and older scholars on the sermon and recognizing they all saw it as about human flourishing. And so really my book is actually just kind of a recovery project. It's not really anything new. It's really trying to say, let's go back and see how the earliest Christians would have understood this. And I think they understood it as a philosophy of life that brings flourishing in that sense. So
have you ever gotten pushback? And this is just it's a question I'm throwing out there, but where it almost feels like, okay, Dr. Pennington, it kind of feels selfish for me to be concerned about the good life or happiness. Or, I mean, haven't I been told, take up my cross, die daily, you know, let's wait for the new heavens and new earth. We live in a broken, like all of those things.
Yeah.
There does seem to be a backdrop of almost as a Christian, one can maybe get nervous of like, is this even okay? Like, is what we're talking about okay?
You're asking all the right questions. You're a very good question asker. That's so important, both theologically and personally. Like, yeah. And boy, I mean, I wrestle with that as well. And I have really come to see, first of all, again, the biblical witness is all about shalom. But let me say it this simple way. Every time Jesus calls us to sacrifice, to lay down our lives, to take up the cross, etc., it's always motivated by the greater good that will come as a result. Think about, in fact, it's even true for Jesus himself. Do you remember what Hebrews says about Jesus? That he endured the shame of the cross. Why? For the joy set before him.
Yep.
And what I came to realize as I started to study the kind of the philosophy of this is that this idea, to not use too fancy of a word, but the idea of altruism, that something is only valuable if you don't get personal benefit from it. That's what altruism is. That is a very common modern ethical idea that goes back to especially a guy called Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T. But that is not in the Bible at all. It's not an ancient philosophy. It's not in the biblical teachings. In fact, the way that Jesus constantly appeals to us, the whole Bible appeals to us, is for our greater good. The Bible never says, hey, do what I said and suck it up because I said so. You know, maybe our dads said that to us, but the Bible is always saying, don't be dumb, right? Why are you hewing cisterns, to use the way the prophets talk, that will not really hold water? Or think about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. Jesus says, don't lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, because how dare you be thinking about treasures? No. It says, don't lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. Instead, lay up treasures in heaven. That is, don't trade foolish temporary things for true greatness, both now spiritually and in the future. In other words, the Bible does not appeal to us on the basis of altruism. It actually appeals to us on the basis of self-interest. And the appeal is, don't be dumb with your self-interest. But you'll only find life if you find it in God. And if you try to find it in other ways, you're just going to find destruction. So this is the key to wisdom literature. Think about your own children, right? So I have 6 adult children, still deeply involved in their lives.
I've got 4 think they are adult children. Yeah,
that's part of the journey, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes. But one of them, just today, I was talking to one of my sons who just got a new job, and he's like, he's like trying to navigate, how am I going to tell my kind of hot-headed boss that I'm leaving this other job? I hope this isn't airing today.
Right? No, it's not. No.
Hopefully there's a little delay. But the point is, my wisdom to him that I would give him, that he's asking for advice, is because I love him and I want the best for him. Right. And I'm not just giving him duties like, you better do this because that's what I said or something. No, this is how God always speaks to us. Here's the way of being in the world that's going to give you the life you long for. Be humble, be honest in all your dealings. All these kind of ways that God tells us to do things are precisely so that we might find flourishing, because he loves us. And the reason I give wisdom to my children in my best days, sometimes I say things to my kids, especially when they're younger, not out of the best motives, out of, I don't want to be embarrassed, I don't want you to shame me or whatever.
Absolutely.
But in my best moments, it's because I love them and I want them to flourish. That's how God always speaks to us. He wants us to find life. He never deals with us on a duty thing, Old Testament or New Testament. He's always inviting us to life. John 10:10, last thing I'll say. I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. That's not just talking about a heavenly disembodied existence. He's saying, I want you to find life, the life that you long for, the good life, the truly good life.
Well, and I told you 30 minutes, so I'm going to make myself a liar just real quickly, because
Okay.
I love your thoughts on, closing thoughts. David Gibson, Scottish Presbyterian pastor over in Aberdeen, wrote a book, Living Life Backward, on Ecclesiastes. And
It's a great book. I loved it. We preached through Ecclesiastes. I loved it. Yeah.
Unbelievable. But makes the point that I think dovetails with what you're saying is, there's almost this permission that has to be granted to us as believers to enjoy things.
Absolutely.
And I don't get the sense that Jesus was walking around miserable all of the time.
Nope.
But
all those medieval paintings of him as like dour and angry, people were drawn to him, and especially the real people were drawn to him and loved him.
And I think one of the reasons is they saw him flourishing.
Absolutely.
Which is maybe what he's recasting, in that you call it the first, I might misquote you on this one, but I think you call it the first document of the New Covenant.
Yeah. It's the Magna Carta. It's the first teaching and the first book of the New Testament. I think that's pretty significant. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you so much for adding your voice to the Downline community. I had a ton of fun meeting you. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Love to.
I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Downline podcast. Please subscribe and go down and rate us and give us 5 stars. Help us get this content out to as many people as possible, as we hope to continue to equip men and women to join the Great Commission and make disciples for a lifestyle as a lifetime.